The cat before me looked more like a Pokemon than a real animal. Is she? I began in a whisper. The tall woman in charge of the animal shelter corrected me. He's a he. I looked back at the cat. His ears were long and large, like the ears of a lynx. Long, fluffy tufts of fur were sticking up from the tips of his ears. His eyes were large yellow orbs, full of secrets and mischief. His fur coat was similar to a tabby, except his head and ears were covered in dark gray fur. His whiskers were long and fine. I held my hand out near the cage bars. The cat was sitting grooming himself near the back. He looked over at me as I beckoned. I could swear there was a sentient light of recognition flickering in his eyes, a connection between him and me. He let out a small meow and ran over. He licked at my fingers through the bars and my heart melted. He was the most adorable thing I'd ever seen. I stroked at his head through the bars and he was so soft and warm. Oh my wow, he's so friendly. Exactly what I need. What breed did you say he was? The animal shelter employee looked noticeably surprised. Oh my, he's normally shy with new owners. And we're not entirely sure what breed he is. Got him about a month ago. He was found in a dumpster. He was tiny back then, but he's much bigger now and still growing, she said, her voice soft. Oh really? How many owners has he had? I wonder if he's got a bit of Maine Coon in him, or perhaps even Bobcat, I said half-jokingly with a quiet laugh. The animal shelter employee broke eye contact with me. She said hesitantly, well, I'm not really supposed to say, but we've tried giving this cat to a few family homes. And you know, these aren't just random people. These are families who take cats from us regularly. He bit the children and was generally very unfriendly. She tried to make a joke and half laughed. It faltered. My eyes were wide now. So, he's dangerous, but he seems so sweet. I looked over at the adorable cat, now gently nibbling the tips of my fingers. No, not dangerous per se, just needs the right environment. Sometimes the animals we get just aren't well suited for children. Maybe as he gets older, he'll mellow out. As he licked me with his sandpaper tongue, I laughed. That tickles. Oh, I'm so taking him with me. The employee smiled, this time genuinely. Alrighty, I'll get the paperwork together. After a few minutes of signing forms and receiving copies of vaccination certificates, I walked out the door with my new best friend tucked under my arm in his new cat box. My smile was beaming as I walked toward my small green Toyota. As I got to my car, I searched, one-handed, for my keys. My smile fell slightly as I remembered why I had come to the animal shelter in the first place. I had just been through a really bad breakup, after years of our relationship slowly dissolving. My girlfriend of 10 years had moved out and moved on. I was left alone in our old house. It was a large house out in the suburbs, and it felt quite empty to be there all alone. To top it all off, since I'd come out as gay, my super religious family had not really kept in touch with me. My mom sometimes answered my calls, but my dad, sister, and grandmother wanted nothing to do with me. It really hurt. We had always been close before, but because I liked girls and not boys, they refused to acknowledge my existence. Despite feeling horribly betrayed, I tried my best to inform them about my life, but I doubt they cared. So I was feeling very alone at the moment. To add insult to injury, my sleep had been badly affected. Over the last week, I experienced severe bouts of sleep paralysis. I now often wake up early in the morning, completely frozen with panic and fear. I feel a horrible weight on my chest, like my heart and lungs are filled with liquid lead. I hear strange noises and see horrendous shadow shapes move about my room until I can finally sit upright and turn on the lights. I always hold my breath, expecting something to appear in the light, looming over my bed. But the shadows always retreat, revealing nothing. Just my mind being an asshole. I was talking with my friends about it, and they recommended I get a pet to have another heartbeat around the house. This would help me feel not so lonely while I get used to being single again. So, one Saturday I found the nearest animal shelter and drove on over. The rest is history. As soon as I got home with my new companion, I knew the first thing he'd need would be food and water, and a place to go to the toilet. Of course, I had already purchased these all from the store on my way back from the shelter. I set everything up and looked up the major do's and don'ts of introducing cats to a new home. A week went by and my adorable friend finally got a name. I had tried picking a name for him that whole week, but nothing seemed to stick. Most of the names I tried I hated or he completely ignored. But sometimes when I offered up a name, he really despised. His large glowing yellow eyes would fix me with a disapproving stare. Okay, I won't call you Garfield. Well, why don't you give me some suggestions sometime? I said at him, as I felt his impatience leak into his stare. It was a Friday evening and he was sitting on my lap, kneading the way cats do when they want to get comfy. I was busy watching trash of some kind. I think it was a Steve Seagal movie. Anyway, once it was over, the next movie on the channel began. I lazily clicked the remote to check the title. On a blue banner that ran along the bottom of the TV screen, white letters spelled out, Casper, 1995. I rolled my eyes. Nah, I said aloud, as I put my now empty bowl of instant ramen on the table next to me. I switched off the TV. Suddenly, I jumped from fright and yelped as the TV flicked back on. What the? I muttered. Then I noticed my cat was holding his one paw on the remote while glowering at me with his yellow eyes. They shone like beaming, double moons, as if to say, "How dare you interrupt my TV time?" "Sorry." "Okay," I said at him, glaring back. Those eyes of his could be really unnerving sometimes. I looked back at the TV to see the titular character on screen. My cat let out a small meow and jumped down. He ran over to stare at the screen. He held out a little paw and seemed to wave it at the ghost. He pointed and then he turned to look at me. Over the last few days, I grew increasingly convinced he was preternaturally intelligent, definitely sentient. It was sometimes disturbing. Maybe he could even pick locks. I chortled at this thought. But to be honest, I'm pretty sure he could clean up his own toilet if I gave him the tools and the time to learn. So, as he sat there looking at me while gesturing to the TV, I knew intuitively what he was trying to say. "Casper, you want your name to be Casper?" I said. He meowed loudly in the affirmative. I was struck by a sudden pleasant feeling that ran down from my ears into my heart. It was like warm syrup was leaking down my ear canals and into my blood, hot and sweet. "Well, Casper, you are really just one surprise after another." As time continued to fly by, he grew steadily larger and larger. Most cats eventually stopped growing, but he refused. Also, your average cat was a fussy eater, but not Casper. He ate with a voracious appetite that sent bits of cat food flying all over the kitchen floor. He was extremely fond of raw meat, including fish, especially tuna, and he would often meow and beg loudly if I was handling raw chicken in the kitchen. Sometimes he would even break dishes if he didn't get his way. At first, he was happy to stay inside most of the time, but as he got older, he started to scratch at windows more and more, begging me to let him out. Once I thought he was big enough, I decided to trust him and let him roam. He had all his shots and had been neutered, so I didn't believe it was so bad to let him run around. All I hoped was that he came back, of course. On that first day he went out, I sat and waited by the window, my breathing fast and anxious. But by sundown he had returned and expected his dinner. Weeks quickly turned into months, and Casper and I fell into a routine.
Most mornings, Casper would jump silently onto my bed and cuddle with me.
Then when my alarm went off at 7:30 a.m., he would gently lick my nose until I got out of bed, giggling. He would dance between my feet as I walked groggily to the kitchen to prepare our breakfast. Then as I got ready for work, he would sit and wait by the door to the backyard. As I got my makeup on and hunted for my keys, I would walk over and let him out for the day. Then, after work, I would return home, and he would always be waiting for me by the front door. His yellow eyes would glow with happiness when he saw me. His bushy tail would stick up, and he'd run up to me to give me rubs and purrs as I fumbled for my keys and opened the door. I would make us both dinner, and we would cuddle together on the couch while I finished work or watched trash TV. Then just before bed, he'd scratch at the door again. While I brushed my teeth, I'd normally walk over to the door and let him out. Then I'd get ready for bed, often, but not always. If I stayed up late in bed engrossed in a book, I would hear Casper tap at the window, asking to be let back inside. On these nights, I'd let him in and we'd cuddle in bed. His body would hum with loud purrs. Some people say cats' purrs have healing properties. I can honestly understand why. Whenever we were all snuggled up in bed, I swear I could feel his purrs slowly healing my soul, leeching away my traumas and sadness. Like that meow he made sometimes that felt just like a rush of MDMA. His purrs were comforting and restorative. When it came to guests, Casper mostly ignored them and spent his time on my lap. However, there was one noticeable example where he jumped up and scratched one of my friend's boyfriends because he had accidentally trodden on my foot. Besides that, Casper was a very easygoing cat. The last few weeks with him had improved my mood hugely. All my friends and work colleagues, even my mom, noticed the difference in my demeanor. I was smiling again, making jokes. I had even been out with my friends more in the last week than I had in the last year. Then one night everything changed. I had had a stressful day at work. Teaching university-level psychology is not easy, and kids can be exhausting. But the work was very rewarding most of the time. However, the day had drained me, so when I got home I was really looking forward to spending the evening vegging out with Casper. But when I arrived home and got out of my car, he was not waiting for me on the front porch like normal. I frowned and walked over to the door. I called out for him a few times and looked around the perimeter of the house but found nothing. This was the third time now in the last week he'd not greeted me at the door. I wasn't that worried about him, but I was disappointed he'd not be around for cuddles. I'd probably only see him in the morning. He was very large now and I'm sure he could take care of himself. I was more worried about what he might be eating or hunting. I hope my neighbor's chihuahua is not on Casper's menu. I chuckled as I made my way inside. After a dinner of cold leftover pizza, I decided to watch something light and go to bed early. As I sat in bed reading, I decided to leave my window open. I'd done this the last few nights since Casper was out, and I wanted him to be able to get in if he needed. I really need to get that cat door installed, I said to myself quietly as I got into bed with my book. When I awoke, I knew something was very wrong. It must have been close to dawn. Early morning light poured through the window and made its way onto my carpeted bedroom floor. The dark outlines of the bushes and trees were stark against the gray, lightening sky. My limbs were frozen in place, and I felt a strange tension and heaviness on my chest. My heart thumped loudly. I was having another episode of sleep paralysis. I tried my best to regulate my breathing and calm down when I saw a white, spider-like hand slowly emerge from the dark gap under my bed. If I could have screamed, I would have. Nothing but a muffled moan escaped me. My body tried to squirm, but I remained helplessly locked in place. The pale, dawn-colored hand stretched out further. Then I could see another hand, and now arms, and now a masked face, now a dark torso, now legs, all emerging so slowly, so silently, like a horrible insect carefully unfolding itself out of its burrow. Soon a massive figure, all clothed in black, including a balaclava, loomed menacingly over me, my head filled with panic. What the hell? Was this really happening? Was I dreaming? I still couldn't move. Then I saw the figure pull a knife from his belt. It was large and gleamed sickly in the morning light. "Hello there, little rabbit," said a soft male voice. It was at that moment that the paralysis finally wore off. I rolled like an armadillo across my bed and made it to my feet. Running to the door was suddenly all I could hold in my mind. The door handle filled my vision. I ripped it open. I did not dare look behind me. I ran. My heart threatened to explode. As I approached my front door, I felt a hand seize my hair and heave me back. I screamed in pain and horror as I felt myself fall to the ground, knocking over a dining room chair as I did. The masked figure bent over me now, the knife still gleaming. He was breathing heavily. Rabbit can run, but not fast enough. I held my hands in front of my face. "Please, why are you doing this?" I yelled, tears streaming down my cheeks. For a moment, the man remained motionless. Then he crouched on his haunches. He peeled off his mask. I flinched and moved back slightly. The light of the dawn revealed him to be a handsome young man with bright blue eyes and fair hair. Couldn't have been more than 20 years old. I think I even recognized him. Had he been a student of mine? "Why don't you tell me? Why does anyone do anything?" His lip curled into a snarl, and he held up the knife ready to plunge it into my stomach, when suddenly we both heard a loud growl. The sound of it made me think of the zoo and Jurassic Park. The intruder froze in place. His face turned white in the half-light of dawn. My jaw dropped open. An enormous pair of yellow eyes stared at us from the darkness of my bedroom. The light of dawn reflected hideously off the tapetum at the back of the thing's eyes. My lungs turned solid from fear. I dared not breathe. The creature growled and hissed. Its ears bent back and it crouched, ready to pounce. I heard the intruder yell with horror, saw him scramble to his feet. With a roar, the beast suddenly leapt into the air and pinned him to the ground. I heard the intruder scream in pain as whatever the thing was tore at him with its teeth and claws, ripping chunks of meat and viscera. The screaming soon turned to gurgles and then was gone altogether. For a long time,
all that could be heard was the tearing of meat and tendons and the wet chewing of a carnivorous beast.
I sat on the floor, fixated by fear and shock. I felt like if I moved, I would be next to die. I was cold and shivering. The whole time, my mind felt numb and blank. I felt like I'd swallowed TV static, and it had filled up my brain and limbs. Every so often, I would feel a warm fleck of blood or some other fluid hit my cheek as the beast continued to feast messily on the intruder. Soon, all trace of the intruder was gone, save for a massive blood stain. As the light in the house grew brighter, I could finally see the beast more clearly. It was about twice the size of a tiger and had dark patterned fur. Its head was enormous.
Ears were long with tufts of fur sticking out.
The snout was stained red with dried blood. It was busy licking its enormous clawed paws when it stood up and fixed gigantic yellow eyes on me. "Casper?" I said, looking directly at the beast. It looked just like him. I mean, like he would look if he was a giant tiger. I felt my heart accelerate, the blood pumping faster and harder through my veins. Casper slowly stalked up to me, those pale, glowing yellow eyes never breaking their gaze on me. Then, just when I thought I was going to die, he nuzzled his head against mine and began to lick at my scratched knees. I sighed massively with relief. Then Casper looked at me, and I felt words form in my mind that were not my own. Yes, Casper, I like this food best. More food, more like this. Presents, more presents like this. I can give you presents too, but I need more presents. The words were gentle whispers, but their sibilance was overly emphasized and sharp. It hurt to hear those words spoken like that. My head felt fuzzy. Was I really talking with a murderous beast that was somehow my cat? That had somehow eaten a psychotic intruder? Was this real? I blinked my eyes a few times and rubbed them hard. Yay. Okay, well let's see. Oh, and thank you by the way, I said sheepishly, not sure what I should say in this kind of situation. After I'd smoked a cigarette and had some water, I called the police. Casper wasn't happy about the decision, but by the time the officers arrived at the house, he was back to looking like his regular old self. The cops took my statement, which of course carefully omits the part where my monster of a cat ate the bad guy, and I had to spend a few days at a hotel while they dusted, took photos, and processed the crime scene. Despite finding blood, they could not identify the assailant by his DNA alone. However, there had been break-ins and assaults in the neighborhood recently. The police also believed this man had been going around stealing, but may have decided to, as they put it, escalate the thrill. They believed he may have got inside via my open window and had sneaked under my bed to wait. What they figure is, he may have got injured in my house somehow and fled looking for medical attention. However, they had not been able to find any record of him at hospitals. For a short time, the police insisted on leaving a police detail by my house in case he returned. But after a few weeks of no leads and no more home invasions, they began to doubt he'd ever come back. It's been a month since that horrible evening, and I'm sitting browsing the web with Casper. What about this one? I say to him, pointing at the mugshot of a scrawny man with oversized glasses and a comb-over. No, he's too innocent. Must be evil. Very evil tastes better. Evil satisfies longer. I sighed. Since Casper had devoured that intruder, he no longer ate his cat food at all. Instead, he would beg for me to look for people he could play with. At first, I refused, but then he reminded me about the presents he could give me if I helped him. That's when I noticed I had been losing weight. My eyesight was improving. I found scars I'd had for years miraculously beginning to fade. That's when I knew this was all real. Casper was no cat, of course. He reminded me more of a mythical creature like a sphinx or a witch's familiar. What I knew for sure was that he was now my friend and protector. All he asked for in return was a good meal every now and then. Also, there are plenty of people out there who are horrible and hurt others. Why shouldn't we get rid of them? I'm actually doing the world a favor by doing this. And if I profit from it, so what? Casper meowed loudly. That same warm meow that filled me with pleasure, like a drug. There, that one. I hear those foreign feline thoughts invade my mind, the sibilants like nails on a chalkboard. My cursor hovers over the photo of a rather normal-looking man with a buzz cut and dark brown eyes. Mario Davenport, I say aloud, reading his file. After a minute, I close the publicly available database of child sex offenders. Looks like we will be paying you a visit soon. When I was 11, I was at the very bottom of my class until the teacher, Miss Henry, made me sit next to the new kid. Thomas and his family moved into town halfway through term, so he just sort of appeared one day. During his second week, Miss Henry tried to draw him out of his shell by asking about his favorite TV program. "What's a TV program?" he replied. That got a laugh. Clearly, he was playing dumb to put one over on her. Everybody thought he'd emerge as the next class clown, but instead he rarely spoke and aced every subject. A few girls tried befriending him. They dug that children of the corn look, I guess, but agreed he was a weirdo after chatting with him in the lunch hall. As desk buddies, he and I locked horns, a lot, because I was left-handed. Our elbows bumped together whenever we wrote, and he got super pissed anytime I asked to borrow a pencil, so I of course did this as often as possible. Anytime I asked Ms. Henry to split us up, she'd just sneer and say, "Ryan, there's gonna be times in life when you're forced to spend time with people you don't like. Get used to it." One day, as I struggled with a difficult maths exam, Thomas offered to help. I'm guessing he finished early and got bored. It was my first A, without either of us ever agreeing to it. He started helping me with homework and tough assignments, and soon my grades improved so much my mom bought me a bunch of Pokemon cards as reward. I offered Thomas some of the one I already owned, but he didn't even know what a Pokemon's was. Then one day, out of the blue, he asked if I'd sleep over at his place. "Father really wants to meet you," he said. Why did his parents even know who I was? We sat together, sure, but he knew so little about pop culture. Getting through a conversation was like chewing cold. Still, I wanted to thank him for his help, and my mom didn't raise any objections. So that Friday I packed some clothes and cycled over to his place. I drove down several short roads flanked by woods, past a train station, toward the outskirts of town. Thomas's two-story house sat at the top of a long driveway so steep that I needed to jump off my bike and push most of the way, and all the windows were either boarded up or had the curtains pulled shut. Things got spooky the second I arrived. Thomas and his parents waited patiently to greet me, each grinning like they were on a poster for tooth whitening. Everybody had matching blonde hair and dressed in plain shades of brown, gray, and white. A large man introduced them as the Donovans. My preteen brain categorized him and his wife as old, but in retrospect, there must have been a 20-year age difference there. Mr. Donovan walked my bike into the garage while me and Thomas followed his mom inside. Something was wrong with the house. It looked too sterile, no clutter, zero toys scattered about. Plus, the antique furniture was older than my grandparents'. In every room, sheets had been draped over objects mounted along the paneled walls, and Mrs. Donovan made a point of telling me that touching the sheets is strictly forbidden. She led us into a sitting room decorated with crucifixes, and more crucifixes, of varying sizes. We kneeled down on a colorful rug, facing each other. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock. At last, Mr. Donovan joined our group and led a prayer for the standard stuff. Good health, blessed weather. Even though I'd gone to Protestant church with my grandparents, I couldn't figure out what religion we were meant to be practicing. He obviously thought of himself as a spiritual leader and devoted a lot of time to the blind sinners who would suffer swift retribution on Judgment Day. It wasn't until he called for a minute of holy silence that I heard a low, shaken voice. I concentrated hard, tuning out the clock. There were muffled cries from somewhere within the room. I peeked my left eye open. Nobody was watching, although the way the family didn't stop grinning made me shiver. I glanced around the room. We were alone. When I turned back towards the circle, Thomas's mom was staring straight at me, her smile practically splitting the seams of her face. Quickly, I shut my eyes, already anxious to go home. The silence seemed to last forever. Finally, the spiritual leader clapped his hands and said we should go out back and toss a ball around. On my way out of the room, I listened for more cries, but the sound had died off. I figured my imagination got the better of me. As Thomas and I tossed a leather ball back and forth in the long grass, his dad watched from a crude decking area, beaming, like at school. Thomas threw with his right hand, whereas I favored my left. We kept trying to pass each other bad shots, competing to make the other miss a catch. It was all in good fun. Though Thomas acted even weirder than at school. Away from his parents, he at least seemed interested in subjects like TV. But now he strictly spoke about Bible stories and recited his favorite verses. I sidestepped his questions, my spirituality as much as I could.
My arm was aching by the time Mrs.
Donovan called us for dinner. In the kitchen, we gathered around the table, and then she brought in a metal pan, presenting 5 boneless chicken breasts, lathered in lumpy gravy and canned peaches. Before we ate, everybody linked arms for another prayer. And part of me wished the ritual would never end, because then we'd need to choke down the food. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then those cries started up again, closer than before. It sounded like a child, and their voice had a panicky quality. If it wasn't for the threat of another glare from Thomas's mom, I would have peeked. As the prayer dragged on, the crying became more hysterical, until finally something rattled against the wall behind me. Mr. Donovan's voice raised, thunderous now, and drowned out the sound. I'm not sure which scared me more, but either way, my arms broke out in goosebumps. The sermon ended 5 minutes later, and we sat there in silence until the head of the table said, "Amen." I checked the corners for sobbing children, finding only more sheets. What then? A CD player? My imagination? The uncooked chicken made me gag. I didn't want to cause trouble, so I picked around the moldy peaches and spread out the plate so it looked like I'd eaten more than I actually had. There was chocolate cake for dessert, but Thomas's mom went around slicing a piece onto each of our plates, which were still covered with chicken and gravy. By that point, my stomach was growling, so I scoffed down a top layer of cake which hadn't touched anything else. I wanted to leave. Faking a bellyache, I asked if they would call my mom and have her come pick me up. Thomas's dad raised an eyebrow. "No need. We have a special remedy." He told the rest of the family to pray for my health and led me out of the room. The front door was on my left, and I briefly considered making a run for it. But the second I did, Mr. Donovan's hand clamped around my shoulder, tight. His smile never wavered, but something about his eyes made me break out in goosebumps, like an implied threat. "So, I let him guide me into a vintage bathroom. There was a covered cabinet above the sink, and the tub was already full. A thick layer of scud, plus a few dead flies, floated along the surface. Mr. Donovan poured something into the murky water, salt maybe, and ordered me to strip off my t-shirt so I could dip my midsection in. I told him I'd made a miraculous recovery. "Ah, the power of prayer," he said, grinning so wide I could count the back teeth. After that, he announced it was time for bed, despite the fact it wasn't even dark yet. Upstairs, at the very far end of the hall, a huge object spanning the width of both walls was covered by another sheet. We got ushered me into Thomas's room, which was even more dull and lifeless than the rest of the house. A queen-sized bed, one small cupboard, and a single wooden chair tucked in the corner. We needed to share the bed, but only after another round of prayer. Then, it was lights out before 9 o'clock. Alone with my friend, I rolled over and asked what religion his family practiced anyway. He gave the vaguest answers possible, and when I pushed him, became hyper-defensive. So, I said, "Hey, do you ever want to punch Miss Henry right in her stupid ugly face?" That made him laugh, away from his parents. He became more like his school self, not normal, but closer than before. We argued over who the hottest girl in class was, followed by the most annoying. Without meaning to, I brought up one who always teased him, and it was like all the energy leaked out of my new friend. "I know everybody thinks I'm odd," he sighed. "They just need to get to know you like I did. They'll come around." "You think so?" "Absolutely." He smiled. Then, after a little while, he said, "Hey, want to see something creepy? I'll show you if you think you're brave enough not to wet the bed." I rolled my eyes. He wanted to rattle me, like when we played ball. "Sure. We've got to wait until Mother and Father retire for the night." I kept asking what he had planned, but he wouldn't answer. He got a kick out of keeping me in the dark, I think. He waited until the house fell quiet, and then swung his legs out of bed, this way, in the chilly, dark hall. Enough moonlight shone through the windows beside the staircase to see by. As we tiptoed past several closed doors, that crying returned, growing louder as we approached the object beneath the black sheet. Not my imagination then. "Facing me," Thomas whispered. "Don't worry if he looks at you. Just make sure you look away fast. You'll be fine so long as you look away fast." Before I could ask what that meant, he crouched down, grabbed the corner of the sheet, and pulled it back, revealing an antique armoire. Suddenly, the crying became less muffled. A mirrored panel ran along the bottom section, surrounded by fine, gargoyle-like carvings. Still holding the blanket, Thomas pushed his left ear against the carpet and stared at the glass. "He's there. Come look quick." I just wanted to get this over with. I lay down. For a second, I stared at the reflected hall, confused about why we were even there. But then an out-of-place shape caught my eye. I told myself it was my reflection, but then realized I had no reflection. A boy was standing in the corner with his back to us. His shoulders went up and down like he couldn't stop sobbing. "Do you see him?" Thomas asked. I swallowed a gulp, my blood running cold. "Niato, huh?" My brain scrambled for an explanation. It was a trick, or a nasty prank. I looked behind me. Nothing. Only a bare patch of wall. "He's not there," Thomas said. "Only in the mirror." When I looked back, the boy was much closer and crouched on his side, nose to nose with me. His features were all stretched out, long and narrow like a funhouse mirror, and he had a shock of blonde hair to go with them. His thin lips twisted into a grotesque smile as the boy reached out to me, the tips of his fingers pushing through the glass. Into reality, I couldn't move a muscle until his face is only inches away from mine, his breath blasting me in the face like a gust of cold air. I scrambled away. If my throat hadn't hitched itself shut, I would have screamed. Quickly, Thomas dropped the sheet and dragged me up by the shoulder, then shoved me down the hall. Behind us, the armoire thrashed from side to side, its hinges squeaking, the boy crying again. Now his voice had an almost hysterical quality. Back in the safety of his room, Thomas pressed his ear against the door until the armoire quietened down. "We are blessed Father didn't hear," he said. "Now we sleep. Father said we aren't to rise before he wakes us to begin the morning ritual." He must not have been the least bit scared by what we saw, because he ushered me into bed and dozed off straight away. But my body wouldn't quit trembling. What was that thing in the mirror? Were there more of them? Is that why they hung sheets everywhere? But why keep any mirrors at all? One thing was for sure. I couldn't spend the night in that house, but Thomas's dad would never let me go. I needed to get the hell out of there without being seen. After Thomas's breathing eased into a rhythm, I swung my legs onto the floor and tiptoed out of the room, toward the stairs. But as I approached the top, footsteps came clomping along. I ducked behind the nearest door. Through the narrow gap, I watched Mr. Donovan march past with a rectangular object tucked beneath his arm. There was a tinkling sound from beneath the sheet. He carried it over to Thomas's room, grunting the whole way, and disappeared through the door. My stomach lurched into my throat. I didn't want to find out what he had planned. I flew down the stairs, carefully, quietly. I kept my hand against the wall for guidance. The front door was locked. My bike still was in the garage. I hoped, but how did I get there from the landing? Above my head, there were angry shouts of, "He's gone!" No time for plans. I sprinted around the ground floor, flying from room to room. Cries rang out in everyone, and now the objects beneath the sheets danced on the walls, bouncing around. The crying child sounded terrified now, like they were in pain. Past the kitchen, there was a cramped utility room with another door. The temperature plummeted as I bolted through it, into the garage. The light switch was on the inside wall. I flicked it, then a naked bulb blinked on. Junk was scattered everywhere. Car parts, step ladders, boxes of old newspapers, and more sheets thrown over different mirrors, each flapping and twisting. There were more cries, except not just the boy, and for a second I was afraid to move. But then a door slammed shut behind me, and I ran for it. My bike was propped up against the wall beside the exit, its handlebars stubbornly tangled with a Christmas tree. After a few tugs, it came loose, and it was like setting off a Rube Goldberg machine. A mop and bucket fell into a stepladder, which clattered to the floor and sent a bag of marbles sprawling across the floor, and so on. I grabbed the bike's handlebars. The exit was one of those old fold-up doors you needed to twist the handle to open. My hands were shaking so badly I needed to set the bike aside and focus solely on this task. The door rotated up. Behind me, Thomas's dad burst into the room, and for the first time he'd stopped smiling. He rushed after me but struggled to get through the minefield of junk. My bike's rear wheel became tangled with a sheet, and when I started running, it came away like a magician ripping away a tablecloth. I heard the mirror fall to the floor and shatter. Laughter rang out, and when I glanced back over my shoulder, bone-thin arms were reaching out of the glass towards Mr. Donovan as the garage light rapidly flicked on and off. Mr. Donovan screamed. I will never, as long as I live, forget the terror in that scream. Pure adrenaline got me out of there. Without slowing down, I sprinted to the top of the driveway and leapt onto the bike and flew down the hill. Behind me, screams rang out from deeper in the house. I didn't stop to look back. Mom wasn't pleased about me cycling home so late, but I made up an excuse about Thomas's family getting sick and needing to leave in a hurry, so she let it slide. I knew she'd never believe my story. I tried faking an illness to get out of school because I was so anxious about seeing Thomas again, but she was having none of it. I spent all of Saturday and Sunday wondering about what I'd seen. On Monday, my desk buddy sat without breathing a single word. We never spoke again, and we didn't bump elbows once. To my great relief, Miss Henry announced Thomas's family had moved again the very next day. I never saw him after that, although for a while I had nightmares about his dad dragging me back inside their house. And they tend to flare up anytime I see a mirror-fronted armoire. My name is Ethan and my friend Aaron, and I have a bit of a niche hobby. We're urban explorers, basically for the uninitiated. That just means we like to explore abandoned man-made structures. My favorites have always been places like water parks and theme parks. Aaron is more into the spooky stuff like hospitals and such. We can freak ourselves out at times, but for the most part, we never believed in anything other than the corporeal. We've been doing this in our free time for around 10 years now, so we are pretty experienced. We know what to bring, how to avoid getting caught by the police or security, and when to get the fuck out of a place. Recently, we went to go visit my brother for a few days in Virginia. He just had a new baby, and I wasn't able to make it down for the birth, so I was making up for it a few months later. He lives in a small town called Holly Hills, about 30 minutes out from Richmond. It's a pretty boring place, but my brother tipped us onto a cool spot to check out near town. An old abandoned mall simply named the Holly Hills Mall. It was built in the early 80s by some wealthy lumber family that wanted to bring more people to the town. Houses need lumber, and that means more money for them. As you can guess, it didn't really work out. The mall was operational for about 7 years before it shut down in 1987. I know none of this is really important, but this helps me get my thoughts in order. And honestly, the history of these structures is part of the allure for me. Anyway, we decided it would be fun and planned a trip on the last day in town. On the way to the airport for a late flight, we woke up bright and early, packed our bags and supplies into the rental car, and said our goodbyes to my brother, his wife and their kids. The mall sat right on the edge of town. I thought this was odd, seeing as how they usually build that kind of thing central to town for ease of access. but I didn't think much of it. The mall was surrounded by pretty heavy brush and trees, as well as a tall chain-link fence. The entrance was blocked off by a typical dilapidated gate, held closed by a simple chain and padlock. Aaron pulled up to the gate and I hopped out to apprise the situation. Oddly, the padlock wasn't even locked. Unusual but not unseen. Sometimes people just stop giving a shit about these old places and don't even check on them anymore. Honestly, it makes us a bit more relaxed in these situations because it usually means no security. I opened the gate and Aaron pulled the car through. The building wasn't the biggest mall we've seen, but it was bigger than we expected. We drove through the deserted parking lot and pulled the car up to the first entrance we saw. We grabbed our supplies and entered the building. The mall exploration itself was pretty uneventful. It was cool to see all of the ads and architecture that seemed frozen in time, like we stepped back into a stale, post-apocalyptic version of the 80s. There was a pretty massive hole in the ceiling where the skylight had given way to snow or the elements or something. The tree that sat in the center of the courtyard had grown massive and was protruding out of the hole in the ceiling. Aaron does these explorations for the fun of it, but I am a bit of an amateur photographer, so I do it for the photos mostly. I snapped a bunch of what I think would have been amazing photos, but unfortunately I lost the camera. Well, I didn't lose it per se. I know exactly where it is, but we'll get to that. During the mall exploration, I did have a feeling that we were being watched. Distant sounds of glass crunching underfoot, or a figure just out of the corner of my eye that disappears right when you look in its direction. But I knew this was just my mind playing tricks on me. There were no signs of security, and no real reason that, even if the cops knew someone was in the building, they would even care to come check. At least that was my thoughts on it, so I ignored it. We hung out in the food court for a bit, ate some sandwiches we had packed for lunch, and then decided to make our way to the car. We got to the car, loaded up and headed out, but on our way to the exit, we noticed a parking garage. It was a 5-story garage from the looks of it, and though usually uninteresting, for some reason Aaron wanted to check it out. We spent less time in the mall than we thought we would, so I figured what the hell, we had the time. We entered the garage on the first floor, marked as floor 0. We drove up to floor 4, did some donuts, and Aaron tried his best to reenact Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift on the way down. I was clenching the entire time, of course, because I didn't want to die. But also, it was a rental car. We didn't have the money to pay for damage done by joyriding in an abandoned mall parking garage. We got back down to floor 0, had a laugh, and started toward the exit, until we noticed the ramp heading down to a lower floor. Aaron pointed out how odd it was that there was a huge parking lot plus a parking garage with 5 floors above ground and seemingly subfloors below ground, for a fairly small mall in a small town. So we thought, we'd make one more detour to see what was down there. Obviously, we were expecting either darkness or water. And we found the first option, darkness. Aaron turned on the brights, and we drove around and found nothing. As expected, what we didn't expect was to see another ramp down to another subfloor. So of course, we decided to make a game of it. We both guessed how many subfloors this garage had, and Aaron headed down the ramp. I had guessed, too, that this next floor was going to be the bottom. He said 5. He was being stupid, but imagine our surprise when there was yet another subfloor. We both laughed in disbelief when we came around the corner on the 4th subfloor to see a ramp down to the 5th. This is a 10-floor parking garage, including floor 0, for this mid-size mall in this tiny town. What were they thinking? They really overestimated the draw that this place was gonna have. Curiously, we headed down to subfloor 5. At this point, it was dark, like super dark. There was no other light from anywhere other than our headlights. We rounded the corner and were in silent awe to see yet another ramp down. We both looked at each other and I think one or both of us said, "What the fuck?" Without further discussion, Aaron steered the car down the ramp to the next floor. For the next 6 floors, we drove on in awe and confusion. We were now 11 floors underground. It didn't make sense. Aaron started coming up with theories, getting excited that maybe we'd found the entrance to a secret government base or a sprawling underground doomsday bunker. But he stopped mid-sentence when we both saw something we weren't expecting. A car. It was parked in a spot with its headlights on. As we pulled closer, I decided to roll down the window to see if I could hear anything. Immediately, the unexpected cold from the parking garage filled the car. It was mid-May at the time and was a fairly warm day, so the cold felt out of place, but we were underground, so I choked it up to that. I could hear the sound of our tires against the pavement and the hum of our car's engine. As we pulled up next to the parked car, I could hear that it, too, was running. The car itself looked like it was an older make, something from the 70s or 80s. Inside, it was seemingly empty. I suggested aloud that perhaps the car belonged to the owner of the property, or a security guard who was doing his rounds, and that he might be back any minute. but Aaron pointed out the car was covered in a thick coat of dust, like it had been there for a very long time, but it was running. I figured it just needed a wash. Aaron did what he does best and convinced me to get out of the car and investigate further, only after a bunch of protest and suggestions that we just head out. But he persisted. I exited and carefully made my way around the car, looking inside for any sign of life. But inside there was nothing but leather car interior, except for the passenger seat, where a satchel sat, with a thermos resting on top. The keys were in the car, and the radio hummed softly with static. Oddly, everything inside the car also seemed to be covered in dust. Aaron urged me to open the door, and I decided to give it a try, but of course it was locked. I looked around the lot, only being able to see the door to the stairs, and the elevators next to it, illuminated by the headlights of the two cars. I hurried back to our car, closed the door and rolled up the windows. I urged once again for us to make our leave. If there was a security guard lurking around, I didn't want to have to deal with that, especially before our flight in a few hours. Again, Aaron protested. He had to know how many floors this thing had. I can't say I wasn't curious as well. So we left subfloor 11 and headed further down into the depths of the structure. We continued on in silence for 12 more floors before I spoke up. This was fucked. It didn't make any sense, and at this point, it just felt wrong, dangerous. I was in the middle of expressing this to Aaron when I noticed he had stopped the car and was staring silently ahead. I looked and was astonished to see a horse, a fucking horse, just standing there. It had the thing around its nose, the reins or whatever, and it was just standing there. After a moment of staring in confusion, Aaron said something like, "Is that a fucking horse?" And I replied with some sort of grunt of confirmation. The horse finally turned in our direction, and I'm pretty sure I screamed when I saw the skin hanging off of the side of the horse's face, his skull exposed beneath. It was then I saw the blood on the floor, a large streak going from beneath the horse's hooves off into the darkness. I didn't want to know anymore. I wanted to get the fuck out of there, and I told Aaron as much. Aaron, against his and my better judgment, wanted to go on. He wanted to know what this all was, but this time I didn't let up. I was louder and more insistent than I've probably ever been with him, and he could see that, I think, so he agreed and threw the car in reverse. We backed up and started back up toward the ground floor. At this point I decided to try my phone. I had figured I wouldn't get any signal underground, and I was right, but I tried it anyway. Nothing. Again we drove in silence for a few floors. Aaron finally broke the silence to apologize, but I stopped him short. The floors were numbered. Ever since we started heading down, they were each numbered B1, B2, B3, Ect. We were on B23 when we turned around and headed back up, but the sign I was staring at in that moment said B26, 3 floors lower than when we started heading back up. I thought someone was fucking with us, but it was all too elaborate of a prank. Still, it was impossible. There was no way we were traveling further down by driving up the ramps. It was physically impossible, but there we were, floor B26. Aaron was just as confused as me, obviously. He got out of the car, unannounced, and walked over to the sign on the wall. He grabbed it and began to shake it, then stopped and stared, clearly trying to figure it all out. I rolled down my window and called for him to get back in the car. This was followed by another voice, repeating my words, not mine, not Aaron's. He froze in place as the voice whispered loudly from the darkness, "Get back in the car." Aaron did just that. He closed and locked the doors and rolled up the windows. We agreed that we needed to get the fuck out of there. This wasn't fun or adventurous anymore, but we didn't know what to do. We thought we were getting the fuck out of there. I remembered that we headed back up on B23, and we decided that we should just keep going up. If the numbers keep rising, we should hit ground level by B46. It didn't make sense, but it was the best we had. We continued driving back up. Aaron was driving a bit quicker than before, and just as we thought, the numbers kept rising, which seemingly meant we were descending. But we held out hope that it was just some weird fluke. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe we didn't see those signs on the way down. We traveled in silence again, all the way to floor B35, but it was an uneasy silence. We were afraid at every turn at what we might see, but there was nothing. Mostly, there were a few floors with things that I did notice, some of them subtle, others glaring. Aaron was focused on driving and didn't seem interested in any of the strangeness we encountered on these floors for the most part. On one floor, I swear I saw a long dining room table with 2 figures sitting at either end, illuminated for only a few seconds by our headlights. Another floor seemingly had a cot in each parking space. They looked to each be occupied by a body, alive or dead, I don't know. One of the strangest, that even caused Aaron to stop the car for a moment, was a floor that didn't seem like a parking garage floor at all. It looked like we had pulled into a forest clearing. The pillars of the garage, now tree trunks though the concrete ceiling was still visible above. There were plants, grass, bushes, and a pathway leading to what looked like a small cabin in the distance. The window glowed as if there were someone home, and smoke seemingly billowed out of the chimney. The curiosity overcame my fear and I rolled down the window. The sound of crickets, cicadas, and a cool spring breeze filled the car. Aaron and I looked at each other for a moment before Aaron blurted out, "Nah, fuck that," and continued on up the ramp. Finally, after what seemed longer than it should have, we reached floor B46. Nothing. I started to cry. It was too much. The realization that we were lost, underground, without any way out was starting to make me feel trapped. We were trapped. It was like I could suddenly feel the weight of every floor above us on me all at once. Aaron kept his cool. He tried to console me. He tried to offer explanations, but there was no explanation. We were in a labyrinth of a parking garage. Aaron started driving with purpose. He turned around and started down again. B47, B48, B49. He stopped the car, turned around again, and started driving back up the ramps. B50, B2, B52. He started to scream. Anger, frustration, confusion, all overflowing into a furious scream. Then, in a deafening echo, his scream reverberated around us. Outside of the car, within the parking garage floor, the windows rattled, the car shook, and then shut off. We were now in pitch blackness. The interior of the car was only illuminated by my cell phone, which I had plugged into and had been charging. I picked up the phone and turned on the flashlight. Aaron was desperately trying to start the car, but there was nothing, not even a click. Then he screamed, this time in alarm. In front of us, in the darkness, were two large eyes staring right at us. I have to express that when I say huge. They were massive, each seemingly the size of the wall. They felt almost flat and unnaturally still, but you could feel the consciousness behind them. Something was staring right at us. The whites were snow white, and the irises were an icy cold blue. The pupils were dilated and pitch black. I said fuck at least 15 times in a row, and Aaron slammed his fists on the steering wheel over and over. A voice, seemingly inside the car, whispered again, "Get back in the car." Aaron's percussive maintenance seemed to have worked, because the car started back up, without him even turning the key. Whatever was down here seemed to want us to leave, and we wanted to leave too, but we didn't know how. Aaron put the car in reverse and spun it around. I could still see the eyes in the mirror. He sped up the ramp,
totally disregarding the numbers.
He drove a good 6 or 7 floors before I noticed something standing out in the darkness. Each floor now had a dim light. I was able to calm Aaron down enough to listen to me, and I pointed it out. He stopped on the next floor to see the light in the distance. It was a door. The door to the stairs is illuminated by an emergency light above it. It was our only chance. It was our last option. He drove over and parked the car in front of the stairwell door, illuminating it fully with the headlights of the car. We both bolted out of the car. Aaron flung open the door, and we started running up the stairs. After the first flight, we saw the number on the stairs, B57. We were ascending. I started to tear up in excitement. We continued on, faster than before. For 20 floors, we basically ran, energized by the fact that the numbers were going down, which meant we were going up. Around B30, we started to slow down pretty significantly. We were still making our way up, but we were tired. It was then that I looked back for the first time. The stairwell above was lit on each floor, but as we made our way up to the next floor, the lights on the previous were turning off. Turning back to head up the stairs, I ran into Aaron, who had stopped in front of me. He was looking up at the top of the next flight of stairs. I looked at what had stopped him. It was a person, I figure, huddled in the corner at the top of the stairs. They sat with their head buried into their knees, shaking. Their clothes seemed faded, old, and dusty. Maybe a homeless person that had gotten lost. Maybe the driver of the vehicle? I called out gently to the stranger, something along the lines of, "Hello, are you okay? Do you need help?" Aaron scoffed. He said we needed help. Screw this guy. He started up the stairs, but when he got near the top, he hugged the rail, facing the figure the entire time. Slowly, he rounded the corner and called me forward. The stranger didn't move. They just sat there, shaking, arms wrapped around their legs, face hidden. They were mumbling something, but I couldn't make out what it was. I followed Aaron's lead and carefully passed the person. Same as before, no reaction. We moved on, leaving the figure behind. Aaron lead as before, and when I made it to the top of the next flight of stairs, I looked back down, startled to see the gaunt face of a man. His cheeks sunken in, his face pale and old, his eyes a piercing pale blue, staring at me, silent, unnaturally still. I didn't say anything. I slowly walked up and rounded the corner. He stared at me the whole time. Again, I ran into Aaron, who was looking up at the top of the next flight of stairs. It was a figure. It looked like the same stranger. I looked down at him on the previous floor, staring at me, and the next floor, face buried in his knees. We traded what the fuck looks, but Aaron said, just ignore it and keep going. We're too close. So we did. Every floor after he was there, hiding his face as we approached, staring at us as we left. It was unexplainable, but so was everything else so far. We made our way up, finally reaching B1. This time, there was no man in the corner. I looked back to the previous top step, and he wasn't there either. I felt like this was a good sign for some reason. We made our way up to floor 0, and were relieved to see light shining through the cracks of the door. Aaron stopped for only a moment, and pushed through the door. He began to laugh. I followed him through, but the cold of the parking garage was back. There, before us, were the bright headlights of a car. Our car, where we left it on floor B58. I had no words. Aaron walked back into the stairwell and fell to the floor, distraught and broken. I told him we can just keep going. We could keep going up, but he wouldn't move. He was tired and defeated. His stoic bravery had finally given way to hopelessness and fear. So I decided to go up to the next floor to check it out. I ran up the stairs, and I felt a sudden warmth. I could see the light through the cracks of the door, but I knew it was different. I knew it was the sun. I burst through and was blinded by the sudden light of the sun. After the hours and hours in darkness, it took a few moments for my eyes to adjust. We had made it. We were free. We were alive. I ran back down to the previous floor to tell Aaron, but he was gone. I ran out through the door, into the garage to check in the car, but he was nowhere to be seen. I called for him, shouted at the top of my lungs. My voice echoed through the parking garage, but nothing. I didn't know what to do. I started down the stairs, but stopped cold. I couldn't go back down. I couldn't get lost down there again. And then I saw, on the top stair of the floor below, the figure was back. It was Aaron, sitting in the corner, his hands wrapped around his knees, staring at me. I called to him. I ran down to him, but when I got to the stair, he was gone. I looked over the railing down at the next flight down, and there he was again, staring. I couldn't go down anymore. I couldn't. I called to him, pleaded with him to come with me, to get it together and get the fuck out of there. But he just stared. I promised him I would come back. I cried as I turned around and made my way out of the garage, as I left my best friend behind to save myself, because I was too scared. I ran from the parking garage, across the parking lot, past the gates and to the road. Finally, my phone had a signal, and I called the police. They came out, and I tried my best to explain what happened. I knew it sounded crazy, but I told them the truth. They went and checked out the parking garage. They searched the entire thing, as well as the mall and surrounding area. Nothing. In fact, they told me there were no subfloors in that garage, like I dreamt it all up. How the fuck could that even be? I was tested for alcohol and drugs, and fined for trespassing. When my brother arrived to pick me up, I tried my best to explain what happened, but if it couldn't get any weirder, he swore to me he didn't know who Aaron was. They've known each other since we were kids. He's been my best friend for 20 years, but he swore, his wife too, and kids. None of them remembered him. After that, I looked for any evidence of Aaron I could finf. All the pictures on my phone were gone. My camera was still in the car, and there was no proof of his existence online. Anywhere. I didn't dream him up. I don't do drugs. I don't drink. I don't have any history of mental illness. I didn't make up 20 years of friendship. I've been seeing a therapist and started some meds. It hasn't helped. Nothing has. Something doesn't feel right. This world doesn't feel right. Like I came out of that parking garage into a life I didn't own. I feel I don't belong here. Every day it becomes more and more clear to me that I have to go back. I don't know what I wanted to get from this post. Maybe just to tell my story. For people to know I existed. Aaron existed. Maybe to find someone who knows what happened to us. Who knows something about the Holly Hills Mall. Who can make any sense of it. Either way, I have to go back. I have to find Aaron. We have to get back in the car.